And welcome back to Migration. Today we're talking about a really interesting topic that is near and dear to my heart. We're talking about what can go wrong along the return path back to our natural, enlightened state of awareness. And it's extremely important to remember that it is our natural state of being. There is no hill to climb to get back to enlightenment. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of work to do, but it's more about unlearning what you've been taught along the way. As we approach total freedom from the cage of identification and all of the bliss and the insights that arise along with that, the opportunities for the ego to get sucked into a facsimile of enlightenment will begin to multiply. We might call this premature enlightenment, where you obtain a direct experience of the world from the bounds and limitations of ordinary perception, only to return to the safe cage of the thinking mind and identity, which then declares itself enlightened. This may be a mind which has genuinely tasted the larger potential of consciousness, but then it points to those experiences and it says, that's it, I've done it. Mission accomplished. This is an awareness that is still very much ruled by the fears and desires of a someone. Someone who still thinks of itself as being small or weak. Those who fall into this kind of trap can become very confused and, in extreme cases, even dangerous to themselves and to others, especially if they join groups of other like-minded individuals or even acquire some kind of following for themselves. So, how does this happen exactly, and what really are the dangers of confusing actual enlightenment for yet another belief system? And how can we make sure that we ourselves don't fall into this same trap? Today we are going to explore one of the more famous cases of just this kind of problem. So get comfortable, smoke 'em if you got 'em, and get ready for today's episode of Migration. Soon after the steady stream of lucid dreams and astral projections and paranormal phenomena began flowing into my life, I naturally began seeking out the wisdom of others who had much more experience in these matters than I had. Just someone who might be able to help me along my own path. Now, of course, you first have to be able to tell the difference between a real master who truly does not groom an identity or an ego any longer, and someone who's just really good at imitating someone who is enlightened. Of course, history teaches us that many people are terrible at making those distinctions. Well, what do enlightened people look and sound like? Is it someone who talks softly and smiles a lot? Someone who looks like they're in a state of bliss all the time? Or perhaps someone who wears a lot of flowing white robes with beads and crystal necklaces? I've met a lot of New Agers over the years who are certain, for example, that enlightened people must be of Indian, Japanese, or Native American descent. One of the first philosophers that I came across early on, who I was really excited about, who I was convinced held really deep insight into the nature of human consciousness, was an Indian guru by the name of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, and he would later go by the name Osho. In fact, that can be another little trick that the ego can play on us, to drop the old name and acquire a new one. There's nothing wrong with that in and of itself. In fact, there truly can be a lot of benefit to dropping the name that you've been associated with your entire life. That's really great. It's a great way to drop a lot of our identification and detach ourselves from the bundle of the ego connected to our name. But the trap can be in thinking that you can't also have the same exact kind of problems with the new identity and the new name that you have picked up. So it wasn't until after I had finished a couple of books from this Osho character that I ended up mentioning it to my dad at one point. And I said, Dad, I'm really excited. I've been reading this guy Osho, or this Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, and he burst out laughing because he remembered the stories about this character back from the 1970s. He remembered how this Bhagwan had built this massive cult of thousands who overran this tiny, quiet town in Oregon, who would eventually be responsible for all manner of mayhem, including arson, the poisoning of public officials, immigration fraud, drug smuggling, and a series of assassination plots. You can learn the entire story in the Netflix documentary Wild Country. Rajneesh would become my greatest inspiration for my main antagonist in my first novel, Tripping the Field, which partly serves to explore this exact subject we're talking about today. Why someone can become particularly dangerous when they enter this pre-Enlightenment stage. When I learned the truth behind who this person was that I had been so moved by, who had really changed my very perception of consciousness on so many different levels, I was pretty horrified and I was really confused. I didn't know how to integrate that into all the respect that I had acquired for this man. Here was a man who spoke beautifully and eloquently on the nature of mind, the nature of desire, the deeper implications of peace and of hate. His words changed my perspective on what it means to allow the present moment to truly be your guide. I wouldn't have been so disillusioned had I believed that this was just a guy who was really skilled at reciting the words from other enlightened masters who had only been an actor regurgitating the wisdom from other people. I don't believe that that was the case at all with Osho, and this is most certainly not an isolated incident. We've witnessed this same behavior from countless spiritual or religious figureheads and even cult leaders since the beginning of recorded history. And of course, unfortunately, yes, it continues to this day. So what the hell happened here? This Rajneesh character was clearly on a genuine path of expanded consciousness, who had attained brilliant and beautiful insights about the nature of reality. And while, we're never going to know exactly what happened in his specific case, I want to offer a way to put this straying into a darker path into a perspective for you. Please keep in mind the process I'm going to lay out here can unfold in so many different ways. So what I'm going to give you is just a general framework of the possibilities when you stray down this darker path. As you merge ever deeper with that larger ocean of awareness, which we all are, this bubble of identity that you've been grooming your entire life, the wall that ultimately separates you from enlightenment, grows ever thinner. Now let me be clear that it only appears to separate you from enlightenment. There is in actuality no real separation. These walls are ultimately all illusions. You increasingly see your reality through the eyes of the universe, and less so from this keyhole perspective that can only see the personal concerns and anxieties and desires you've identified your awareness with. As that veil becomes ever more permeable, direct insight into the nature of our collective experience grows stronger and becomes clearer. But at some point along the way, it's like the ego starts to get clued in to where this path really leads, and it starts to understand that this path that you're on is eventually going to end with its total irrelevance. And yes, I'm speaking about the ego as if it's actually this individual sentient thing, but this is only for illustration purposes. You know, the death of the ego is something we all hear about in one form or another along the way, but at some point the ego really understands this with crystal clarity, and in some cases it's almost like it panics. So at this point it can do a total 180, and it will run back to the world of division and fear and desire and, a general need for power over others. But now it's carrying some deep and genuine insights about the nature of reality in its arsenal. It opens the potential for weaponizing spirituality, if you will. As you progress along this path, you're going to find that you can have hundreds or even thousands of direct encounters with collective, boundless consciousness, and the attachment to form and identity and the body can continue to come back over and over in 1,000 different ways with methods that grow ever more elusive. And the ego will pull increasingly clever tricks to stay relevant, to convince you that you should continue to be invested in it. And I don't want to veer off into another tangent, but that point is something I'll save for another video entirely. So for now, I'll give you something to chew on. That dynamic I just mentioned, where the ego pulls increasingly clever tricks to convince your awareness that it's still a necessary reality, is part of a larger mechanism which is responsible for making those who meditate regularly actually more intelligent. This is kind of an abstract concept that's going to it deserves its own discussion, so I'm going to do a whole other video just on that idea alone, how meditation actually ends up making you more intelligent. When it comes to spiritual experiences or insights, the ego can actually even begin to identify with those as well, and it will kind of take it under its wing and say, these belong to me. These are things that I am doing. Look at how amazing and powerful and special I am. It's that combination of dynamics that can result in a very confused and possibly even a dangerous person who can sound like a wise and worldly shaman. They may offer genuine, heartfelt insights about the nature of the cosmos, but there's still an ego kind of lurking in the background, still calling the shots. This results in a person who simultaneously believes that they are a godly type of a person on some level, that they've seen this truth firsthand. But it's also a person who carries all the fears and desires of any other individual identity that still feels small and weak. The bottom line is that if the ego is still in control, it is going to seek power in one way or another. That might be through resources or money or the devotion of others. Whoever still believes that they are an individual something, they're going to operate from a sense of lack on some level. Yet, on the surface, what you're hearing are still beautiful words of wisdom that can truly bring real healing to us. Again, the wisdom that I picked up from Osho, I'll still say to this day, it was absolutely valid. I can still pick up any number of his books, and I can agree with damn near everything that he says in them, but obviously he knew how to use that insight and charm of his to his advantage. If he and his cult wouldn't have been stopped, who knows what further damage and suffering he may have brought to this world. So how do we avoid this happening to us? How do we make sure that we don't fall down this rabbit hole ourselves? The first thing I want you to keep asking yourself is, am I grounded in the present, or am I living through yet another story about what I am? An enlightened person isn't going to identify themselves as an enlightened person. They have no interest in your faith. They have no interest in your loyalty. You should be asking yourself, how much am I just referring to or relying on my past stories and insights about my enlightened experiences, as opposed to continuing to actually remain in a fully surrendered state of consciousness in the moment. The kind of personality you want to watch out for is someone who continues to avoid that merging with the ocean of potential. Someone who is no longer allowing the ego to dissolve into the present moment. This person instead props themselves up by a lot more stories of what's happened to them in the past. They're often someone who's trying to impress you, maybe with a flashy resume, so to speak, who they've trained with, how many years they've been meditating, and yada, yada, yada. I'll have you know I've trained with 100 yogis in India, and I've spent 6 months living in a cave in Japan, and blah, 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 blah. Their strength is going to rely on the past in one form or another. Now, please understand, our stories can absolutely serve a purpose in small doses. For example, I refer to lots of things that have happened to me in the past, so I can introduce myself to newcomers so they can kind of understand where I'm coming from. And yes, I will from time to time tell stories so I can illustrate some concept from direct experience, but I really do try to keep that to a bare minimum. In fact, I started my own channel here after years of appearing on other people's shows because that's all they wanted from me. They wanted the crazy stories of astral projection and paranormal forces I've gathered over the years. And I get it, that is what attracts more viewers. The insights that you gain from present moment awareness isn't always terribly exciting, and that is why I continue to imagine that I don't think that this channel will ever be mainstream type of popular on any level. It takes a certain type of person to really appreciate some of these finer points that I'm making on this show. One suggestion I have is to kind of make an agreement with yourself right now that you will never down the road tell yourself that you are so enlightened that you don't need to meditate anymore, that you are somehow above merging with present moment consciousness. And people do that. They do it all the time. They tell themselves that they're above all of that, and they crown themselves with some title of guru or yogi or shaman. They don't need to drop the ego anymore. They're above that. That's for beginners, is the way they might see it. Don't let yourself fall for that trap. Not from someone else who's posing as a being more enlightened than you, and don't fall for it from your own identity, where you imagine you're somehow above others. There are no divisions. Everything in your world is a play of consciousness, which all stems from the same source. All I can hope is that some of you at this point are starting to ask, wait a minute, Ian, maybe you're just one of these charlatans too who's building his own cult. Maybe this whole discussion here is just you trying to distract us from how full of shit you are. Why should we trust what you're saying? And to that I say, excellent. You shouldn't, not for a moment. That is the approach you should take with anyone offering spiritual or religious or cosmic insights. Either their insight rings true for you and it's useful, or it's not. No blind faith should ever be required. So that is all we have time to cover on this topic for today, but please, any questions or comments, please write them in the comments below. I promise I will get around to everyone. As always, please like and subscribe and share this video if you've enjoyed some of the insights we've been discussing here. And until next time, peace be with you. Take care. Bye-bye.